Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Germany is one of few Western countries to remain truly industrialized, boasting a massive manufacturing base and trade surplus. And yet things have gone off the rails, with the economy contracting and the governing coalition collapsing.
Our guest today is Wolfgang Münchau, whose new book argues we are witnessing the end of the German economic miracle. And in today's dumb question of the week, we ask, why don't Germans invest in the stock market? All right, let's get into it. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Wolfgang Münchau. Wolfgang is co-founder of Eurointelligence and the former editor-in-chief of Financial Times Deutschland. He's a leading economic and policy expert, and his new book, Kaput, The End of the German Miracle, diagnoses a profound weakness at the heart of the world's third largest economy. Thanks so much for joining us, Wolfgang.
Well, thank you for having me.
So perhaps before we get into what's behind the end of the miracle, we need to understand what was so miraculous to begin with. So how would you characterize the German economic model?
It was clearly an industry-based model. It was based on industrial production. But there's more than that. There are more countries than Germany is just doing industry. The characteristic of this model went beyond that. It was about exports, industrial exports, but especially, and I think this is the important bit, export surpluses. So Germans exported more than they imported. And if you actually look at national accounts, I don't want to bore readers with technical details, but what it means is it's a saving surplus. And while you think it's great for people to save, and that's surely true for households, it's not such a great idea for countries to save more than they invest, because it means they invest abroad. And so Germany ended up creating a saving surplus. These savings were invested abroad. They were badly invested, not to offset the risks of its models, because industrial exports are risky by definition, because they expose you to supply chains. They expose you, in Germany's case, expose you to Russia, to Russian gas, expose you to Chinese people buying German goods. So rather than offset these risks, the Germans actually invested in the same technologies. So this was VW building factories, car factories in China. And they just had to close one at a great loss. And this is the kind of cluster risk that Germany built up over the years. So it exposed this. The model worked extremely well while we had globalization, while Germany was competitive. And the competitiveness of Germany was influenced by a mixture of reforms, cheap gas from Russia, and optimized global supply chains. But in all of these factors, and also a friendly geopolitical environment where nobody cared whether you were actually selling to Russia or to China or to the United States, all of these things have flipped. And so this is why something that was successful, and I'm not denying that it was successful. It was successful. But it was also, in a way that a gambler can have, heads 5 times and you think you're really good at this. Or you basically, you're playing Russian roulette 5 times and you think you're the expert. And this is a bit like, your luck has turned. And virtually everything came the other way. I've not seen this happening, and I've been warning about this system, but I didn't see that everything would just turn against them. This was quite of the astonishing thing. I mean, we had a supply shock, we had geopolitical shock, we had the oil thing, the gas thing. And then we had, a government that cut off the nuclear power. That's quite astonishing. And in many ways, you have to sort of pay tribute to Germany that despite all that bad luck, they're still, standing. I mean, this is a fairly resilient country, and very few people would have been able to withstand that shock. So this is not like a Germany, sick man of Europe type book. This is very much, I was looking very much at what made it strong and what made it weak, and how to actually reduce the risk of the system. And that is not a debate we're having in Germany.
I mean, I have to say, sitting in London, I really enjoyed reading the book and just hearing about another country's weaknesses and shooting itself in the foot for once.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. This is not intended to give sort of some justification to Brexit or anything like this. So if you think Europe is some kind of a basket case, no, this is not what it is. I mean, Germany and Britain have actually shared some characteristics, some economic characteristics. I mean, they have very different economic models. Britain has a services-based model, and it did not make itself so dependent on any particular export market. However, Britain suffered a fall in its productivity growth rate after the global financial crisis, and it didn't recover from that. That was around 2007. And that's happened to Germany too. Germany had this, it was running high. And, around 2018, this is the year I put when things flipped around. Germany was strong until about then, and then things flipped. People didn't see this. There's an awful lot of noise behind economic statistics. But it's been really going on for a while. If you look at especially the industrial side, which is the growth energy of the German economy, it really went sort of slowly and steadily downwards. Not like dramatically, but it was sort of a steady decline. Whereas in the rest of Europe and the world, it sort of went up, and you can see the gap growing and growing. And and deindustrialization is happening as we speak. I mean, this in the last weeks we saw car industry shedding jobs. Supply industries, Bosch and various other car suppliers shedding jobs. Mercedes, VW announced job cuts or factory closures. So this is really, this is alive. And the deindustrialization isn't just something I'm warning about, something might happen in 10 years. This has happened and is happening. And the question is, can it be arrested? And should it be arrested? Because I think therein also, the question is, going back to the old system might actually not be the best idea. But I'm kind of alone on this point.
Just reading the book, I was just struck by how unlucky they've been, because it's quite easy to imagine a world in which doubling down on what they were good at would have done really well for some time before, problems with energy supply started to kick in. So they were very unlucky. I can see why they wanted to keep things as they were.
Yeah, I mean, the good times last, and, in politics, who cares? Angela Merkel was certainly not somebody who lost sleepless nights over whether her model is economically sustainable. That was never a consideration. But just look at China. I mean, China was a development country. This was actually foreseeable. China was complementary to Germany in the sort of the first 2 decades of the century. China bought German plant and machinery. The Germans were very good at that. China built plants and factories and produced consumer goods. And these consumer goods, did not compete with German goods. But over the last 10 years, China encroached onto German markets. It bought the solar industry, basically. It bought and closed the German solar industry. But it became clear that this sort of coexistence between Germany and China, this peaceful coexistence would end, and that there would be competition. And Germany now has a trade deficit against China.
Yeah.
That is a miscalculation. And the Russia thing, look, I mean, Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, he annexed Crimea in 2014. There's been a long history that this could go wrong. Was to any observer of the situation a possible. And the whole Nord Stream, I remember covering the Nord Stream 2 debacle, and Congress over 2 years passing laws declaring that undertaking to be in violation of American interests. And so it was clear that there was pushback.
I mean, Trump said it, didn't he, on stage, and was laughed at by the German delegation. He said, you've got to get off Russian gas.
It's a famous scene, the German ambassadors being so arrogantly confident that Trump was, didn't know what he was talking about. Trump was right. You don't often hear me say that, but,
First person to ever say it on our podcast.
But on this point, I mean, what can you say? I mean, that was right. I mean, the Germans made, there was a dependence, and nobody, I mean, Angela Merkel has just published a book, and she defends this decision. She's still today, I mean, if you talk to people back in Germany in those years, they basically looked at you like with a blank stare and said, but the gas is cheap.
It's so cheap.
Why don't you want us to have the gas? I mean, it's like, we need the stuff. Sorry. I mean, and then, when you're basically in that situation, then the idea to say that, okay, it's just, it's not entirely bad luck here. It's like the gambler. It's like, a gambler's luck might turn, but if you play a certain game and then it turns, luck turns against you.
I don't know what game they're playing by shutting down all the nuclear plants.
Well, that is the nuclear story is a long one. Virtually no one outside understands it, and I have to say I'm struggling to explain it to people, because it's really hard to explain. Because the Green Party was born. It was kind of the successor of the 1960s student movement. The fear of war was always present in Germany for the entire period. The idea of a nuclear bomb was just horrendous. Then Chernobyl happened, and that just completely freaked everybody out. So there was this sort of anti-nuclear sentiment.
And of course, don't forget 99 red balloons. That's how I learned about German sentiment on nuclear energy and
Absolutely.
weapons.
And in 98 to 2005, the Greens were in power. And it was then that they decided on the phase out of nuclear energy. But they decided a very long timetable. And on that timetable, we would still have nuclear. I think it was by 2030. But Merkel, in 2011, after the Fukushima disaster, she cut it short to 2023. And that was the end. And that happened actually now. And when the Greens were again in power, they weren't in power, since 2005, but they came back to power in 2021, and they were the second largest party in the coalition. And this was the thing that they insisted on. So when you have a three-party coalition, everyone comes in with their wish list, and that was the number one thing on the Greens. And the Greens said, look, if we don't get this, then we can't be in the coalition. That was a mistake, including for them. The Green leaders should have actually stood up to their own party members and said, look, you may hate us for this, but if we do this, we would actually do something highly irresponsible. And they didn't want to sell this. So when they came to power, nuclear power was 14% of the German electricity supply. And while that is, it used to be more, but 14%, that's a lot, especially since it was regionally skewed. So, that was basically the south and the north. So this was a very significant amount that they needed to cover through gas. I think the problem for the Germans with the energy now, they have, after the Russian thing, after the pipeline blew up, they had to switch away from Russian gas to gas from the world markets. And they're paying gas at world market prices. Even though the price of gas has fallen since Russia's invasion, it's still much, much higher than what Germany used to pay. And, now they're starting to use coal again.
What I didn't realize, and one of the points you made in your book, was about the rise of the far right and how gas might have affected that, and also how that effectively boosted the AfD party.
Yeah, indeed. The AfD kind of started life as an anti-Euro party. It was actually founded by economics professors who were deeply unhappy about the euro. It was in the middle of the euro crisis, and they wanted Germany to leave the eurozone. This group got kind of ousted by a group of, shall we say, neoconservatives. They were nationalists, talked about immigration, but they were conservatives. I mean, on a political spectrum, that generation, I would still put them on sort of the conservative, the right wing of the Tory party. That changed, and that generation was also ousted by a group that became far right. And they had close relations with Russia too, and they are advocating a return to the good old days when Germany, got its gas from Russia. They blamed Ukraine. Ukrainian commando, blew up the pipeline, most probably from what the German prosecutor believes to have established. There's no evidence yet that the Ukrainian government was behind it. It's not a very credible thing to claim that this was just independently of any government, because this was not something that your average private citizen could do. Blowing up a pipeline it requires a certain skill set to do that.
I wouldn't even know where to start, Wolfgang.
Nor would I. And I would assume that when it happened, people were saying there were so-called state actors, as the name went. And it doesn't look good, frankly, and it didn't help. It really didn't help anyone in Germany who wanted to, who made the case for aid for Ukraine. That was clearly a factor, and the far left and the far right opposition both seized on this issue and basically said, look, it's Ukraine that is killing our pipeline, that they're forcing us into a policy to break ties with Russia. And, when we were with Russia, things were better. We had cheap gas, we had steel companies that were producing steel, our car companies were still successful. So this was a better time. And that's the far right story. And then they're strong, and immigration keeps on giving. And I think that's firmly established at around 17, 18, 19% of the vote in the polls, and a fairly steady presence in the German. They won't be in government, but they are there.
So you mentioned the car industry there, and that seems to be the sort of totemic industry, doesn't it, for Germany throughout the decades. And as you mentioned, Volkswagen has started closing factories, or is proposing to do so in Germany for, I think, the first time ever. And they seem to have missed the boat, don't they, really, when it comes to electric vehicles? What has gone wrong? Is this an existential risk for the car industry in Europe?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. It's worse than it actually appears in the newspapers, because they fail to see it. One important point I make in the book is, because government and banks and finance and the industry, they all sit together. So when they get things wrong, they all get it wrong. There isn't sort of a minority view in the car industry. There isn't a small car company that says, I'll do this differently, and I go in a different direction. In Germany, they all go in the direction. Everybody in Germany thought that the electric car was just a phase. And I was talking to, friends and relatives a few years ago, and I always got the message from everybody that the electric car had a higher carbon footprint than the diesel car. And everybody was telling me that same story. I'd not heard that story before. They must have seen it on television. There must have been somebody on television, someone with the credibility to say, oh, the electric car has a higher carbon footprint.
Someone sat in a factory outside of Munich or Berlin, maybe.
Could be, very much, but it could also be true as a snapshot, because if your electric car production is small, then that thing has a higher carbon footprint than if your production is efficient. If your electric car uses energy that is produced in a coal-fired power station, then it has a higher carbon footprint. So this, as a snapshot, it might be, even true. I don't know, but even if it were true, it doesn't tell you what will be true in 10 years' time. And today it's no longer true, and in 10 years' time it will surely no longer be true. But they thought, and virtually everybody I spoke to in those years, they all thought that was it. It was the killer argument. They had won the argument because, they had a higher carbon footprint. They were in denial. That was I quoted Ferdinand Piëch. He was one of the, big beasts in the Porsche family. The Porsche family is, is sort of the aristocracy of the German car gang. And, he said that there was no space for an electric car in his garage. And everybody, thought that was very funny.
Get a bigger garage, mate.
The guy had a big garage because VW, it owns Bentley, it owns Maserati. Apart from all these VWs and Audis and Porsches, that's part of the group, and Seats and Skodas. There's a big company. That guy had a big garage. There's no question. He wouldn't have a Volkswagen Golf in his garage.
I don't know why they have to claim that fossil fuel cars are more green. Like, if they were, why would you have to fake all those emissions tests?
Indeed, that's very clear. And I think, you still get the defenders of the diesel car, and you get them writing very angry columns these days and saying, if only we've been allowed to develop them further, because, the industry lost credibility. That's sort of an argument they overlooked. And so they put all their energy into these fake software. I mean, it's actually quite sophisticated software.
That was the German tech industry, wasn't it?
That was the German tech industry. I mean, really, and that fintech company that went up in smoke and, led by what turned out to be a Russian spy.
Wirecard,
absolutely. They had absolutely terrible experience with their sort of forays into sort of 21st century tech. And that was one of them. Whereas the Chinese were already starting they were starting slow strategically. Chinese government did subsidize the industry in the early days. There was an awful lot of money that went into the production. They invested into the supply chain of car batteries. I remember the Germans first kind of started to be alarmed in around 2019 when the economics minister realized, oh my God, the money in electric cars is no longer in engines. It is in batteries and in software.
Yeah.
And they realized that Germany doesn't know anything about either. And then they started, okay, let's do batteries. And in the last few months, all the battery ventures have kind of hit difficulties. I mean, I reported on one by Stellantis and Mercedes and Total. They had a venture in Germany and some other places in Europe. And, one of the managers said, look, I mean, what we had planned, we can't do anymore. Everything is delayed. And frankly, I don't think we can run this profitably without further government aid. This is not a continent, given, with our energy costs and our, the circumstances in which we operate, in which we can produce car batteries at rates that are competitive to those in China. The Chinese kind of own this technology. And as far as software is concerned, which I think is the big money earner in the future, the AI, the self-driving car, this is where the big payoff are. The Europeans, and especially the Germans, are totally nowhere to be seen.
I mean, I think you describe in the book how Germany was the kind of king of the analog economy, and now we're digital, and they've been a bit left behind. But why don't they have a sort of startup and entrepreneurial culture? Or at least it doesn't seem to be from the outside.
I mean, the analog business, there's something that they kind of inherited from pre-war. Germany was the champion of science before the Second World War. I was reporting, I think one of the universities, Göttingen, had over 40 Nobel Prize winners, more than probably any university in the history. After the Second World War, all that was gone. Scientists, many of them were Jewish, were either murdered. Many actually emigrated well before, either before the Nazis came to power or in the early years. They had left by then and sort of went to the United States. By the end of the war, these departments were totally depleted, mathematics, science departments. What wasn't depleted was engineering. There were still, very strong in engineering. They were still also very strong in chemistry. So these were sort of sectors that they kind of retained and where development happened, where also entrepreneurial activity happened. And the Germany that was, that came out of the Second World War was liberal because they didn't have, it was a new country, a new country that started from scratch. It didn't have laws. It didn't have regulation. It was like a Wild West economy. And obviously that changed over the years. But this was an ideal economy for entrepreneurial activity. Now, Germany, like Britain, over the years, we had different governments, controversies about, abuses and stuff. And then you had social policies and people wanted protection. And then we got these policies. Later we got, protection on data protection against AI. And that's sort of how it happened. That's why, entrepreneurialism kind of disappeared in the 1980s, 1990s. Then Germany kind of had its big companies that were very successful. And like many people who were successful thinking, why fix, what isn't broken? Entrepreneurialism was always, a nice sort of evening speech type of stuff. But Germany seemed to do well without entrepreneurs because, they had big companies. And the digital economy, that was one of these national misjudgments. And, they kind of optimized 1980s technology.
The fax machine, right?
Yes.
Wolfgang, I read this week that the Bundesbank, that's Germany's central bank, has finally said we're going to stop accepting faxes in January.
I saw that today too.
It's the end of Germany.
That is astonishing. I would think that the money supply will probably collapse on that day. The police still use it, doctors still use it. Yeah, but this is 2024. People. We haven't been using it for 20 years, and we used to have then services, email services that would communicate with the fax service.
I don't think I've ever sent one in my 16 years.
No, you wouldn't. You'd have to be quite old. When you confront them with this information, saying that actually, do you know that nobody in the world uses faxes anymore? Then they say, but we have to do it because it's the only way to have legal signatures. This is the argument. And then they said, yeah, but other countries changed the law.
My wife said she spent about a year of her life in notaries' offices in Germany and Austria.
You spend a decent amount of time, absolutely.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 Stocks and Shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and some of the lowest FX fees on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Customers can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which offers 1.5% cashback on all transactions until January the 1st, 2025. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 Invest or Stocks ISA account, make a minimum deposit of £1 and use the promo code ROMIN within 10 days of signing up, or use the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk and you may get back less than invested. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Pies and Autoinvest is an execution-only service, not investment advice or portfolio management. Automatic investing refers to executing scheduled deposits. You are responsible for all investment and rebalancing decisions. Free shares can be fractional, terms and fees apply. One thing I had no idea about was technophobia in Germany. I always assumed that they'd be really au fait with technology, but I'll just quote from your book. There's a great line. It says, mercantilists old and new are suspicious of disruptive technologies. They like to trade physical goods. The mercantilist mindset goes hand in hand with technophobia. Add the two together, mix in some fiscal and monetary conservatism, a protectionist financial model, and voila, you have the German economic model in a nutshell.
Yeah, you just summarized my book. Huh?
But why is it that Germany became technophobic, given their background? This was the country of Max Planck, of quantum mechanics, of Boltzmann. How could that possibly happen?
Yeah, it was not invented by them. I mean, all the engineering developments of quantum mechanics, the transistor in 1947, the integrated circuit 11 years later, all the the PC, the computers, and later the internet. These were all developments that were outside Germany, and the country assumed or took the view that this is a lucrative but small business area. They did not see our life would be digitalized. I remember reading a book in the mid-90s by an MIT professor who was basically, forecast that everything we'll do is digital. And I didn't realize that either at the time, that sort of digitalization, we had the computer, and, obviously that changed my life as a journalist because I was starting to write my stories on the computer rather than on a typewriter. But he described that, it's not just our work life, but it's, the way our houses function, the way our transportation systems function would be dominated by digital technologies. And he was very critical of Helmut Kohl's and François Mitterrand's project of high-definition television, which was an analog-based technology, but they wanted to develop this because they felt that would be high-tech, that would be popular, and that would basically also happen while they were still in office. They were wrong because the technology didn't actually make it. And by the 90s, there was a German telecommunications company developed the world's most sophisticated analog telephone switch. Analog telephony, for those who know, it was actually had a very high quality, sound quality. Telephony was much, much better quality than our modern mobile telephony. But it could only do that. It was not able to transport other signals than voice. So they became the champions of a particular technology. They bet the house on that technology. It's like the diesel. They could not fathom that there is another technology. They misjudged this. And it was a national misjudgment because in Germany, judgments are made by consensus. And the government, the companies, the banks, they're all part of that consensus.
So if we're looking at how can Germany get itself back on the right path for the future, it seems that there's some sort of structural obstacles in place. The biggest one everyone points to is the so-called debt brake, which insists on a kind of balanced budget for the German state, which I guess constrains investment, and public investment levels have been low. The infrastructure is apparently crumbling. I can't speak to it myself, but how big a problem is that debt brake at the moment?
Well, the debt brake is responsible for one particular problem in Germany, and this is as you pointed out, the lack of investment, public sector investment. And Germany has bad, cable infrastructure, bad mobile infrastructure. This is sort of one of the visible things. Others point out towards trains. Train travel in Germany has become very unpleasant. It used to have one of Europe's best train services to one of Europe's worst train services. It's significantly worse than it is in the UK.
Now, come on, let's not be ridiculous.
No, it has, because it has.
Really?
Yeah. There is. I recently heard from somebody who was traveling regularly from Frankfurt to Brussels, and he said they had a statistic that only 70% of the trains that go from Frankfurt to Brussels, it's not that they're late, it's that only 70% of those trains actually arrive. The other day, I missed the train. I actually didn't miss it. I thought I missed the train, but it was cancelled. And then I was sitting down on the bench, and then every minute or so there was an announcement saying, "Oh, we apologize, this train has been cancelled, and this train has been cancelled." It went on and on and on.
But the sound quality of that announcement on the analog system was beautiful.
Absolutely. So, the debt brake is clearly a problem. I don't want to deny this. It doesn't fix it. But yeah, you want to start, that's where you start. And I think they will do this. The way to fix this is to do what the UK has done, which is to have a golden rule. And that is to exempt public investment from the requirement to have a balanced budget. It doesn't mean that you can do all your investments for debt, but at least if you incur debt, make sure it's for investment. Don't do it for spending. However, I don't think this will fix the main problem, because the main problem is in the private sector. And the private sector has become not only uncompetitive, but it is specialized on products and services that are kind of not the ones that, especially products that are now being increasingly encroached on by digital competitors, or where China is, changing the rules of the game.
Is it making the same mistake with China that it did with Russia? It's a different kind of dependency, but the dependency is there.
Well, it certainly has. It wasn't a dependency on one raw material or input material, but German supply chains are heavily intertwined with China, so much so that you can't just undo them. It's not like you could say to German industry, shift out of China. This will take a decade.
The US might say that to them, though.
That might happen. And in the scenario where, say, the US and China have a conflict, a military conflict in Asia, and where the US would demand of its European allies not to intervene in the conflict, but at least to stop trading with China. That is a perfectly realistic scenario. Now, that would be a complete disaster for Germany. The German economy would be it would be a massive supply shock. And we learned quite a bit about supply shocks, starting with the pandemic and starting with Russia. This is the mother of all supply shocks. The US is going down this road. The problem for Europeans is not that we are reliant on a particular import. The fact that we don't get a particular telephone from China isn't a big problem. The problem is that so many of the things we make, intermediate imports are made in China. So we are really interconnected. It's really difficult to disentangle this. And it's not that you can just shift these production to Vietnam or Africa or some other parts of the world. This is very complex. And supply chains are not just somebody sending you something. It is about somebody sending you a bit, and then you do something to it, and then you send it back to them. And because transportation costs have become so low globally, that the optimization of the supply chain involves a very significant amount of travel, and therefore that to disentangle this is actually very difficult.
You've got a nice list in the book. You talk about electronics, rare earths, magnets, batteries, and chemicals. All of those come from China. And so that would be a huge problem for your value-add industries.
Absolutely, no. There is a lot. I mean, for example, when we're talking about batteries, they come from China. The Chinese control the entire supply chain of the power system of the electric car. They own virtually every node of that chain. They have the advantage of rare earths and magnets. There are certain types of rare earths and certain types of metals that are needed for this development. And China is the leading nation. They're also leading in sort of alternative battery technologies and hydrogen and other things that might also come in. So they've made sure that if there is another technology, that they're also at least exposed to this. So they have been very strategic about this. They've been very good at picking winners. And the way they did this is to think long term. They said, no, we're not going to challenge the Germans in the diesel car. We're not that crazy. But, we could do something different. And it's interesting that in Germany, no one thought about that. And even today, where you would say, if it was the government, I'd say, look, the big money in the cars is AI. And we have the world's worst AI regulation. Should we not start here? Should we not basically say, look, we need to rethink this? Our car industry is on the verge of disappearing. So rather than saving hopeless factories that have no chance, should we not just encourage our companies to invest in AI and to learn models that allow them to, collect data for the self-driving car? It's not possible. You can't have a self-driving car in Europe and collect data because AI is so restrictive. That would be the response, but you will not find anyone in Germany even proposing this because it's so countercultural. The problem is when there is technology shifts, these are like, I don't like to use the word, but it is almost correct, like a paradigm shift. It's very hard for people to make the jump because the digital economy works very differently.
And you've got to close a lot of factories and lay people off.
Yeah, and but it's also different cultures. Look at the leaders in digital companies. Look at the way they look, the way they're dressed, the way they talk, the way the business models work, the way these companies are financed. They're so different. This is a completely different culture to that of a German manufacturing company where the CEOs drive up in very big limousines and are kind of isolated from normal mortals. And German companies were very much top-down and hierarchical, and whereas these flat hierarchies of modern digital companies is completely alien to them. And that's why they never took an interest. They said, okay, if America wants to do this, let them do this. We do our, we'll specialize in earth-moving equipment, and that people will always need this, which is true. And there are specializations, and Germany might still be lucky that the world might need, German-made tanks or ammunition, and there's certain product categories that Germans are still very good at. But in many areas of our life, digital has encroached on analog. If you look at our modern phone, these were all analog devices at one time, and many of them made in Germany. The camera, the GPS, all sorts of sensors, various, health measuring devices, obviously the phone and the computer. This thing combines a lot of things that had moving parts, and the mobile phone has no moving part. And the same with the car. The car will become increasingly digital. We'll still have wheels.
An iPad on wheels, I think you said.
I called it an iPad with wheels, and I think but the money is in the iPad, and the wheels is the stuff that's around it. A service that we pay a lot of money for with our classic cars, that's going to be a software update. Electric car is a very simple car in mechanical terms. It's not a sophisticated mechanical device, whereas the diesel car is a highly sophisticated mechanical device. So, you can see where interest shifts, you see where money shifts and profit margins shift. So the European car industry its only hope will be as a junior partner to the Chinese in the future, or the Americans. And so it's going to be very different. It's going to employ a lot fewer people. And they will still make cars in Europe, but it won't be an industry with network effects and suppliers of suppliers and big sort of service around, like funding banks that fund the stuff and suppliers to the banks. I mean, this was like 10%, 11, 12% of the German economy is tied up in these networks. The car industry itself is only a small part of that. The country will need to open up and sort of look towards other things to do. I'm not the one to tell them what to do, but I can say that you got to whatever the market suggests you can do. And this is why I also emphasize the importance of capital markets, because the German financial system is really geared towards, is kind of doubles down on this. The average age of the German DAX companies, the stock market listed companies, is about 160 years. They haven't got anyone like Google or Apple or Microsoft, none of these modern companies. The most modern one is SAP. And SAP is kind of an exception because they were a software company that kind of found an extremely lucrative niche in business software. But they started in 1970. They started when mainframe computers were there. And they're basically sort of at the regulatory end of the digital industry. They're not modern high-tech companies. And the EU doesn't have, I was checking of the large 50 tech companies, the only sort of vaguely modern tech company is Spotify from Sweden. They are sort of occupying number 49 when I checked.
Yeah, we could have had DeepMind, but we let it go.
Yes.
One of your points, I think, is a good one, which is that the way that many industries were funded was via Landesbanken, which were quite, let's say, conservative in the choice of funding. So do you think one solution for Germany in the future might be to have more venture capital type funds to make capital available for these innovative companies?
Oh, absolutely. I think it goes much beyond this. I mean, the problem with the Landesbank is not that they were conservative. The problem with the Landesbanken and also the Sparkassen, which is sort of the local end of the banking system. The problem with this, the state-owned sector accounts for a third. The problem is that they are basically run by politicians. And politicians use these banks as sort of extensions of the budget. What you can't finance through your budget, you can finance through your Landesbank. And so these became partly political project. And why does VW get all the money? They get all the lending. They get all these subsidies from the EU. All went to the car industry. And a capital market would work very different. So I would go beyond venture capital, because they kind of did some venture capital in Germany. There is a startup scene. So in the sort of the early end of the food chain of small companies, they are actually improved. What they're lacking is the second, third, fourth phase where the big money. There isn't anyone who would give the successful ones and say, look, here 5 billion and let's have stage 2. There isn't that. And there isn't for that you need a capital market, not a bank. A bank is not meant to take those risky investments because we've told the banks not to do that. We've told the banks to be conservative. So what we need is a capital market. That's what the United States has. Now, Germany doesn't have a big capital market. It has a stock exchange, but it doesn't have a capital market that is anywhere near what the United States or the UK even has. None of the other Europeans have it either. So the only way for them to do this would be to actually create a European capital markets. And this is why people like me have been banging on about the Capital Markets Union forever. And the Capital Markets Union, not so much as a financial services thing where we just harmonize the rules and talk a lot about technical details. But as Mario Draghi said in his reports, this is the goal. We need to spend 800 billion a year in investment we're not spending. That's his estimate, 800 billion a year. Yeah, that's a lot of money. We're not going to get this through the banking system or the EU budget. There's no money for any of this. None of the countries have these finances available. The only way to compete with the United States or China is through a capital markets union. We need to generate these investments. The EU has tiny programs. Americans shift real money, and there's a huge infrastructure. I mean, private equity is really important. There has to be some kind of a market that allocates capital from savers to investment opportunities. And Europe, the people putting their savings, and we don't lack savings in Europe. That's not a problem. The people put their savings into bank accounts. If I had to tell you one thing that they need to do, that's the thing they need to do. They won't be perfect. Nothing will be perfect. But the one thing that can do the heavy lifting to get them away from the analog technology into the 21st century is a capital market. I don't know what the market would invest in, but I know that if there isn't something that Europe is good at, then it would be funded through a capital market. It will not be funded through a Landesbank. That's for sure.
Presumably, a capital market unified across Europe would require countries like Germany to drop their opposition to capital flows across borders. Like, they don't want UniCredit buying Commerzbank, do they? They really don't want that.
So much needs to change. I mean, UniCredit is, you would think they should have done that like 20 years ago. But everyone wants to have their national banking systems because they like to redirect the money to domestic. That's what they fear. If the Commerzbank goes, the lending goes to Italian companies. So we're treating ourselves as competitors for money. The reason they fear a capital market is a capital market doesn't have quotas. A capital market might put all the money to Spain. If you had a capital market, something like Volkswagen, what Volkswagen did would not have happened. A capital market would have been, if this would have been a free capital market, if the government didn't have a golden share in Volkswagen, the company would probably not exist anymore. It would have been split up or been swallowed by somebody else who would, split it up. The company as it stands doesn't make any sense. The capital market is essential, but what also needed for capital market is a fiscal union. And that's Germany also opposed to it. Germany is with this sort of distrust of its neighbors, accepting a small fiscal union. You don't need a federal state the size of the United States. A small fiscal union would have been fine, but there would have been there would have had to be a sovereign bond. And obviously a small fiscal union comes with tax raising powers. It comes with debt issuing powers. This is sovereign. But sovereignty can be constrained. You can explicitly tell the EU you're not allowed to raise income taxes, but we give you corporate taxes. We give you that. That's what you have, and that's your income, all corporate taxes. And they have debt-raising powers subject to certain debt rules. Debt rules would then apply to the EU, not so much to the member states. The member states wouldn't be sovereign, but they would become sub-sovereign. The ECB would primarily deal with the sovereign level of the debt, not with the sovereign. If a member state goes bust, then let them go bust. It wouldn't be systemic anymore. The stuff that needs to happen in Europe is so massive. And during the Eurozone crisis, EU leaders, led by Angela Merkel, decided not to do that. They decided to go in the other direction. So we have a Europe that's splintered. We have more nationalists. It's becoming harder to do. The chances of a treaty change in Europe are zero. And if there were a treaty change, it wouldn't be anything of what I'm suggesting. It would be, in fact, the next step that Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, is proposing is to allow countries to spend the EU money they get by themselves, to stop any EU programs, so basically just turn the EU money as just a slush fund for domestic spending. So the EU is disintegrating.
It's a challenge, presumably, without that strong Franco-German relationship at the heart of it.
Absolutely. That's gone. France and Germany, it's also never been before that they both tend to have the political crisis at the same time.
Yes.
That's a new one. And likewise, France is discussing its domestic fiscal issues, not with any reference to Germany. In France, you would expect somebody to say, look, we have to save it's about 140 billion euros a year from the budget. Now, this is a massive amount. This is where they need to get to. 150 billion, it's like 5% of GDP.
I saw the bond markets have pushed up French yields above Greek yields.
Absolutely. And someone would have said, look, Germany's done this. Germany went in the opposite direction, obviously perhaps too far, but we can't diverge. And if we diverge, there will be a financial crisis. We don't have any stopgaps here. So if France has a crisis, it's existential for the Eurozone. There isn't like a bailout mechanism. The ECB has in theory, a bailout mechanism called TPI, but it's not meant for large countries. It's certainly hard politically to sell it when France's fiscal problems are clearly homemade. It's not like France has been under speculative attack and it's the bad financial markets that did it to them. They just spent too much.
It's funny, I sometimes wake up at night and I can't sleep again because I worry about stuff and things go through your mind. And one phrase from your book, I know that's going to feed my nightmares. It was, France is too big to fail, too big to save.
Absolutely. Once you have overshot your target to such an extent as they have, this was supposed to be 3% and then now it's 6% and rising. France has failed those targets for almost every year since the Eurozone started. France has never observed these targets. Jean-Claude Juncker, the former Commission president, once famously said when he was asked, why don't you ever penalize France? He said, because it's France. It's too large a country to penalize. You couldn't just, put France into an excessive deficit procedure and slap a fine on France for failing to meet the target.
Can you imagine Macron's face if you tried that?
No, it's not happening because this thing was never credible. The idea that the Commission would fine member states is just for the birds, basically. Perhaps the optimistic thing to say is, Germany going a bit like, what Churchill said about the Americans. Germany is really trying all the alternatives now. And all the alternatives to the right strategy. And it's, at the moment, the way I look at the political debate in Germany, it's about conflicting versions of the 20th century. There's a conservative version of the 20th century, and there's a left-wing version of the 20th century. There isn't anyone propagating a 21st version yet. And when that happens, things will change. They have capacity. The Germans in particular, they have people. They have skills. If you're an engineer, you might not be naturally a digital wizard, but you kind of got the stuff that, you got the capacity to do this. So, you can train yourself into this. You're kind of used to this. So, it's not the people. I heard one venture capitalist say that Europeans tend to be, on average, more successful than any other group in the venture capital business. But European companies tend to be a lot less successful. So the problem isn't the Europeans, the problem is Europe. And I think that's particularly the case for Germany. So eventually this can happen, but there's no guarantee. It's like I don't think it'll happen over the next 4 years. We'll just have another phase of the same type of politics, and it'll be another grand coalition or coalition with the Greens. The same people will be in government. There will be some of the actors will change, but ultimately the policies they pursued in the last 20 years, the same parties will be in charge. A subsection of the parties that pursued those policies will be in charge again. It will take a while until they're through this. And maybe there will be somebody in 29 or 2034 when they say, look, let's try something different. But I don't see this yet. And, you would have to see them somewhere in politics. And if, for someone to win such an election in 5 years or in 10 years, they'll have to exist, don't they?
If you're enjoying this interview with Wolfgang Münchau, then you definitely enjoy our conversations about macroeconomics in the PensionCraft chat forums. To learn more about how to join us, simply go to pensioncraft.com/membership.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week is, why don't Germans invest in the stock market?
It's not a dumb question at all, actually. I've been sort of thinking about this myself for a long time, because it is an actually important part of our story here. Germany doesn't have a capital market, and with the capital market, it would be able to redirect savings much more efficiently than through the banking system that cannot take the risks that a capital market can do. The reason is bad experience. The way the newspapers write about the stock market is very much like a casino type thing. So it's all about making a fortune, and they give you tips, secret tips. It has a certain seedy quality. This financial journalism is really quite seedy of quality. Where if this was the UK, I remember I used to be a newspaper editor there, and people were doing this. I was saying, look, you can't do this. This is totally not serious, and you're giving tips of how shares will perform. You never investigated how good your tips were, because if you did, you would probably find that they were not that great. And that was the bad experience they had. There was a period, you remember the dot-com bubble. And the dot-com bubble was much, much worse in Germany than it was elsewhere. It came together with a particular, a seedy corner of the stock market. They created its own sort of dot-com part of the stock market, the Neue Markt. And that thing collapsed, going from peak to trough, a loss of 96%.
Yeah, it's worse than the NASDAQ, wasn't it, in the dot-com bubble?
Oh, yeah, much worse. It's tulip mania style proportion. Everything gone, if you'd been invested there. And people were sort of punting. And the Germans, their relationship with the stock market is really that of a manic depressive. They were either totally against or totally in favor. But when they were in favor, they were just, gambling. And there was never a stock market where people said, okay, let's invest in the future. Let's think long term. Let's get a portfolio of companies. Let's hedge our risks. None of this, where the stock market was always a gambling. And when people wanted to save, they went back to the bank. The difference with Germany, and I think also coming back to one of your earlier questions, when the dot-com bubble burst, for the Germans, that was the end of dot-com. And for the Americans, it was the beginning of dot-com. And that was the moment where things sort of separated. That was when we started to look at gas in Russia. And that's when all this stuff happened that ultimately became so problematic.
Have you noticed any kind of generational difference? Because I do have some young German clients and some older German clients, and I've noticed that they're much less conducive to investing in stocks if they're older, whereas the young people generally seem more au fait with what the stock market is and how to diversify.
I think that is not surprising. Young people are on the internet. The gaps between young people across countries is likely to flatten. So the attitudes will be very similar. But we shouldn't overestimate attitudes in our sort of institutional setting. The way the German system works, banks are safe, stock market, it's not like you have these, the number of funds, the industry, the diversity of the industry, ETFs, the kind of diversity we have here in the UK or in the United States. You don't have that sort of offering in Germany. So even, if you are investing in the stock market, people still talk mostly about, I buy this share or I buy that share. It doesn't have the same sort of depth of infrastructure. And this is why, what I'm talking about, the financial market. This is what it requires. It's not just a matter of attitudes. People acting rational. I mean, the fact that Germans are saving money in banks is relative from where they are, not a totally irrational move. It's just that people live in a different environment in the UK.
So your book, Kaput, The End of the German Miracle, it really crossed some T's and dotted some I's for me. It filled in a lot of the gaps about my understanding of Germany. Some of the macro stuff was really interesting, and the relationships between Germany and other countries, what mercantilism really means. I just absolutely loved it. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your thoughts today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, I loved it too. And you also have a podcast, don't you? The Euro Intelligence podcast, which is great.
Yes, absolutely. Which is every Wednesday. My team and I, we talk about various aspects of European politics, economics, and not so much what this book is, but the wider European aspects. Yeah.
And if people want to get in touch with you, do you have a fax machine?
You'll find me.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.